The flurry of diplomatic activity as U.S. President Donald Trump makes a push to end to the Russia-Ukraine war.
American Special Envoy Steve Witkoff says the leader expected to speak to his Russian counterpart this week to discuss a possible ceasefire.
The U.S. officials are optimistic that a truce can be reached within the next few weeks after proposing terms of a deal which Kyiv accepted.
European allies are now pressing for Moscow to accept the terms as well. Russia had in principle agreed to the truce but set conditions to be met.
For more insight, Dr. John Blaxland, a professor of international security and intelligence studies at the Australian National University and also the director of ANU North America Liaison Office, is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Professor Blaxland. Firstly, what is your expectation for that planned Trump-Putin discussion this week? How optimistic are you that a ceasefire deal could be reached within weeks?
So it is, it's $1 million question. Everybody wants to know, and we're looking to see the art of the deal manifest itself in some kind of breakthrough moment. But there are some significant factors that are working against that outcome in the foreseeable future. We know that Vladimir Putin's ambitions for Ukraine are still unmet, and yet he is coming up against the resilience of the Ukrainian people. A Neptune medium-range missile just fired recently against a significant fuel facility inside Russia. It's an indigenous Ukrainian weapon that demonstrates Ukraine's ability to continue to come up with innovations, technological innovations, and to surprise Russia with offensive action that makes light of their claims that they are winning, and it makes it much more difficult for Putin to kind of portray this as some kind of position where he's given some kind of, a face saving out, if you like. The dynamics are really interesting, though, because while the president of the United States, Donald Trump, has been very hard on Zelensky and has, had support and intelligence on and off again, my sense is that this is actually part of the positioning to try and make the US appear to the Russians as if they are playing hardball with Ukraine, to try and entice them to make a concession as well. Now, whether or not that actually materializes is another matter entirely, because none of us can read the mind of Vladimir Putin or of Donald Trump, and they are effectively the two decision makers here who are going to make the call.
All right, Professor, just to be clear, we are talking right now about a potential ceasefire and not a peace deal. I mean, how far are we away from a lasting truce at this time? It doesn't sound like that's a hip skip and a jump away at all.
So the ceasefire has to have a purpose. And there are concerns on both sides. The Russians are in public already declaring they're worried that this is a ploy to enable the Ukrainians to reposition, to strengthen their positions, to resupply, and to gain advantage, to then re-engage militarily. Conversely, the Ukrainians are worried about exactly the same thing, that the Russians will take a ceasefire and exploit the opportunity to reposition, to gain advantage when they are not in a position to be attacked by the Ukrainians. So it's devilishly difficult to get a position that both sides are agreeable on. Of course, now Donald Trump has the Ukrainians kind of over a barrel, because the deal over intelligence and over logistics support is contingent on this peace negotiations, on the ceasefire going ahead. What he has over Putin, though, is much more in doubt. And that's where I think there's real conjecture about whether or not this is something that is likely to go ahead. The question is, does Putin feel an obligation to give Trump this as a kind of concession to compensate for the effort he's made, for the concessions he's made to Russia in the last few weeks, which pundits are saying, are an own goal. They're saying that this is a gratuitous concession to Russia that shouldn't have been made, and perhaps, if in the art of the deal, this can be seen as the concessions that were enough to get Putin to come to the table and to agree to a ceasefire, then it may have been worth it, particularly if that ceasefire then lays the groundwork, allows the space for an armistice, a Korean War-like armistice to emerge from this terrible set of circumstances.
Speaking of concessions, Professor, and the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz suggested that Kyiv may have to concede some territory to the Russians, abandon NATO aspirations. Do you think these are a realistic expectation for Ukraine, who have fought so hard to defend its territory? And what sort of concessions do you expect Mr. Zelensky potentially making?
So I think the hard play from the United States in the last few weeks has made that kind of concession from Zelensky politically more feasible for him. He was in a difficult position because he had basically promised the Ukrainian people that it was all or nothing, and that the Ukrainians were going to fight on, I should say, until they reclaimed all of the lost territories in the Donbass and Crimea. What Donald Trump has done by playing hardball is basically make that a much more marginal call. This gives Zelensky the space domestically to make the concession without completely losing morale, without losing his political support, and enabling that kind of the deal to come to be viable from both sides. Clearly, what happened in the White House was, the optics of it were shocking. They really put Zelensky on the back foot. But as I say, the silver lining to this may be that Zelensky is now in a position where domestically he can sell this to his own people. He can back down from the positions he's maintained in the past that would, were it not for this very hardline treatment at the White House, been very difficult for him to make for his own constituents,
right,
both inside Ukraine and in Western Europe as well, among his key backers.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Western Europe, because that is something that in terms of them meeting, in terms of them forming a coalition of the willing. They had a meeting on the weekend. They're having a meeting this week as well to talk about potential deployment of peacekeeping forces. Is that something that's feasible? And is there really willingness on the part of that coalition? Because right now we've only heard the UK and Australia voicing support for this plan. And we know Putin's against any form of NATO troops being in Ukraine.
So it would only work if it is drawing on countries from NATO without actually being formally part of a NATO contingent. It would also only work if it's backed by the United States eventually, even if not directly in country. It would need to be backed with American intelligence and American logistics. But there's a real worry here about what happens if this peacekeeping force that we talk about is actually caught between that rock and a hard place. If fighting breaks out, is it going to be like the situation on the southern Lebanese border, where they're stuck between Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Forces? The United Nations, international peacekeeping missions are all well and good if the circumstances are benign. But if it gets hot again, if it resumes warlike conditions, then the terms of reference, it's really, this is where the negotiation gets really difficult. This is where countries like Germany and Poland and others are much more uncomfortable about the implications. Do you really want to put your troops on the Ukraine border in a position where the next point of action is to pull a trigger against Russians?
Right.
That's not something anybody seriously wants to contemplate. But that's the worst case scenario of a peacekeeping force in harm's way.
Understood. Professor, we do have to leave it there for now. We thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. Dr. John Blaxland, Director, ANU North America Liaison Office, and Professor, International Security and Intelligence Studies at the Australian National University. Thanks very much.